Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the time period between 1932 and 1939, a time period known as the New Deal, where the United States, led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, tries to uh, get out of the Great Depression. Here are your video goals. Let's start by looking at the Great Depression and looking at some of the economic effects that come about as a result of the stock market crash in 1929. So there's first the initial shock that, first of all, there's the stock market crash known as Black Tuesday, where in one day, about 30% of the stock market just disappears. Billions of dollars of wealth are lost. And as a result of this, there are a huge number of bank failures. This happens primarily because the banks had given out so much money as loans that when the stock market crashed, most of these loans were lost, and the banks no longer had enough money to support themselves. So the banks had given out so much money that when the stock market crashed, the banks failed. What happens after that is a downward spiral. Things keep getting worse. Because banks are failing, people start to pull all of their money out of the banks. And what this does is this causes even more banks to fail. The banks that are still alive stop giving out as much money. They basically pull back all the money that they have left to stay in business. And when the banks start pulling all their money out of the economy, this makes it hard for businesses to borrow money to grow. At the same time, consumers are spending less money. So what this means is that the banks are failing and businesses are going out of business. What this means for normal people is normal people are losing most of their money that they had in banks, and they're getting fired from their job because their business that was employing them has shut down. So in the end, this results in almost 25% unemployment. Unemployment skyrockets between 1929 and 1932 as banks fail and businesses shut down. It's not looking good, and it's just getting worse. In order to respond to this crisis, the Republican president who was in office at the time, Herbert Hoover, well, he doesn't really know what to do. He believes in laissez-faire economics, which, as we've learned, basically means that the government is not supposed to do anything. It's just supposed to let the economy run itself. But in this situation, banks and businesses are powerless to stop the downward economic spiral. People are spending less money, more businesses are going out of business, there are fewer jobs, and so people are spending even less money. So it's just getting worse and worse, and there's nothing that the private businesses can do about it. Ultimately, Hoover decides to do something that was titled trickle-down economics, which basically is where the government helps out businesses. So they'd give money to certain businesses in hopes that the businesses would use that money to produce stuff and hire workers. One example of this was the Hoover Dam, where the US government hired companies to build this giant dam out west in order to create jobs and also provide electricity. So this helps a little bit, but it's not enough, and it's way too late. And by the time this stuff is going on, there is another presidential election, which leads to the election of a Democratic president. Just to give you a sense of how bad it got under Herbert Hoover, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the problems. So first of all, there were a lot of workers out of work. 1 in 4 workers, that is almost 25% of workers, were out of a job. So they were trying to find work and couldn't find it. Farmers out west were losing their farms. The price of agricultural stuff like wheat and corn was going down, and there were severe droughts and ecological problems. So a lot of farmers were also losing their jobs. Families could no longer afford their houses, so they were ending up homeless. And this resulted in huge shanty towns forming at the edge of major cities. And these were titled Hoovervilles in honor of the president who was unable to fix any of these problems. The photographer Dorothy Lange became famous for documenting the suffering of normal Americans. That one there at the left is known as is a famous picture known as Migrant Mother. It shows a woman staring off into the distance, trying to think, probably thinking about how she's going to feed her kids. The one on the right is called Broke, Baby Sick, Car in Trouble. It shows a woman on the side of the road with her baby and her car off to the side of the road with all of her belongings piled up on top of it. So she has nowhere to turn. Her car is broken. She's out of money. Her kid is sick. What is she going to do? There's really nothing that these hardworking people can do now that the Depression has hit. And so it's pictures like these and stories like these that motivate the next president, F.D.R., to take action and to fix these problems. The government needs to step in to do something about it. And so there's Franklin Delano Roosevelt there, FDR for short, chilling in his automobile with his dog. You'll notice that whenever you see pictures of FDR, he's sitting down, and that's because he was mostly paralyzed from the waist down and could not really stand up for very long periods of time. So FDR usually had pictures taken of him in settings where it would be natural for him to be seated. So sitting in a chair by a fire, or sitting in a car here. So anyway, FDR has a pretty easy time getting elected president because voters are furious with Herbert Hoover and the Republican Party. So the Democratic Party wins by a huge majority. And basically, they don't really know what FDR stands for, but they hope that FDR will offer them change. Even FDR doesn't really know what he's going to do when he gets elected into office. But he does promise to do something. He says, quote, "The country needs bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it, and if it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something." So basically, he's going to try a bunch of stuff and experiment and see if he can fix everything. The big question, though, is what is this going to look like? And the answer comes from perhaps an unlikely source. It is a kind of grumpy British economist named John Maynard Keynes. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets most of his ideas from this new economic system called Keynesian Economics, developed by John Maynard Keynes. And what Keynes' big idea is that the government needs to play a larger role in the economy. That it's the government's job to manage the economy to make sure things work well for everybody. So basically what he says is that in times of recession, when the economy is shrinking, the government should spend a lot of money in order to pick the economy back up. Basically, by spending more money on the poorest people in the economy, this will give them money, and those people will go out and spend that money, and this will create new jobs as businesses start to grow. That's the idea. So the government spends money to boost consumer spending, and that will restart the economy. You can do this through welfare payments to poor people, or you can do it by hiring people to work for the government and giving them jobs. Of course, all of this costs a lot of money. So in times of growth, when things are looking good, the government should tax people in order to pay off all of the debt that it acquired during the recession and then save up for future recessions. That's the idea. And these are the ideas that FDR uses when he goes into office. And the system that he puts in place ends up being known as the New Deal. And basically, the New Deal is organized around three goals: recovery, relief, and reform. And we're going to look at each of these goals and talk about some of the big laws that are passed in order to achieve these goals. But all of them have in common the idea that the government should put money into the economy so that average people have money and can spend it in order to restart the economy. So the first thing that FDR sets about to do is to help the economy recover. That is, to restart the economy that is currently spiraling downward. So the first thing he does is he sets out to save the banks. So the banks are going out of business, and people are afraid that the banks are going to keep failing, so they take out more money, which causes even more banks to fail. And it was stuff like this that led FDR to say the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. If everybody could just trust the banks, then banks wouldn't fail. But anyway, in order to restore trust in the banks, the Democrats pass the Glass-Steagall Act, which basically is where the government insures all bank deposits, along with some other stuff. But so any deposit that goes into a bank, the government promises that if that bank goes out of business, you will still get your money. So this restores people's confidence in the banks and helps people to kind of get back to normal, put their money back in a bank rather than hiding it under a mattress or something like that. The second thing he does is he tries to put people back to work by having the government employ them. And one of the main ways he does this is through the Civilian Conservation Corps, also known as the CCC. And basically what this did is the government hired lots of young people, that is people just out of school, to go do jobs that otherwise wouldn't get done. Some of the big ones were working on national parks, building trails and stuff like that, but they also did all sorts of other stuff. So basically a lot of young people who otherwise would not have been able to find a job went to work for the government. This gave those people money so they could spend that money and helped get the economy going again. And last of all, he started investing in infrastructure. That is paying for roads and bridges and dams and railroads and all sorts of stuff. And one of the most famous ways that they invested in infrastructure was through this agency called the Tennessee Valley Authority, where they set up hydroelectric dams all around the South along the Tennessee River. And by constructing these dams, they were able to provide thousands of construction jobs to Southern workers, but also to provide electricity to much of the South, which was kind of lagging behind the rest of the country. So all of these are designed to make the economy get back to normal, to save the banks and to put money back in the hands of normal people so they can spend it and get the economy going. Second, Roosevelt wants to make sure that people aren't suffering. He's famous for saying, "No one will starve." So basically, while the economy is getting back on track, he wants to make sure that people are not suffering, or at least reduce the amount of suffering. So one of the things he does is he passes the Federal Emergency Relief Act, where the federal government gives out $3 billion to the states, and the states are then use that money to either employ workers or to just give money out to people who need it. So it's $3 billion going from the government back to the neediest people. He also passes the Social Security Act, which provides a secure income for all retired workers. That is, people who are too old to go back to work will just now get money from the government. This still exists today, and all people who work in the United States pay a tax for all the time that they work. And then when they retire, they also get Social Security. And then you've got the Federal Unemployment Insurance, which is basically the government provides short-term payments to workers who lose their jobs. That way they can keep up their normal life until they find a new job. So all of these are designed to sort of mitigate the suffering that people are experiencing as a result of the Great Depression. Also, though, this puts money back in the hands of poorer people so they can spend that money and get the economy going again. And last of all, Roosevelt signs into law a couple of things that are designed to prevent the economy from collapsing again. One is the Wagner Act. And this is a law that makes it legal for workers to unionize and protects them from big business. So this is kind of seen as the final victory of labor unions. Labor unions are now protected from bosses that would like to fire them or anything like that. And this makes sure that workers can get fair wages for their work. And what that'll mean is that more people will have enough money to spend to boost the economy. So workers will now have fair wages as long as they join unions. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt really supported unions, and he was famous for saying, if I went to work in a factory, the first thing I would do would be to join a union. He also sets up the Securities and Exchange Commission. This is a government agency that makes sure to regulate banks and to pass rules. That way the banks and the stock markets don't crash the way they did in 1929. And there's all sorts of rules, and it's super, super complicated. But basically, they just watch the banks and make sure the banks don't do anything irresponsible, like give out way too many loans. So the banks now have to be more careful. That way, future bubbles don't happen like in the stock market during the 1920s. So what are the results of the New Deal? Well, really there are mixed results. So we do see some recovery. So unemployment drops to around 13%, which is a pretty big drop from near, almost 25% at the height of the Depression. But we also are seeing some bad stuff. So one is that government debt is going up, and this can't go on forever. Eventually, the government's going to have to stop spending money, and nobody knows exactly what's going to happen then. Also, by 1939, the New Deal seems to be running out of steam. Unemployment is going back up, and there's really no other tricks that FDR can think of. It's not really clear what he's going to do next to fix the economy. And nobody really knows what would have happened, but instead of having to figure this out, World War II starts, and this sort of changes everything. Economies shift into war mode, and the rules are kind of different during wartime. So anyway, we'll stop the story here for today, and we'll pick it up again next semester by looking at the United States in World War II. So yeah, that's all for today. I hope you found that interesting and clear, and we'll talk about it next week.